certainly will. Okay, I'm wonderful to welcome all of you here tonight. Our guest is Victoria Wilson, who is Senior Vice President, Senior Editor of America's greatest publisher, Alfred Knopf, my editor and my publisher, I have to say, but she's the best and the publishing company is the best. I'm here to talk about Vicky's remarkable two-volume biography of Barbara Stanwyck, but also about reading, writing, editing, book selling, and publishing during the pandemic. And I do have a number of questions about that. But let's start first. Vicky, where are you? There you are. Hi. Hi. What I would like
First,
to know.
May I just say one thing? I want to just thank you, Foster, for there's nobody who's a more adept interviewer than Foster Hirsch. And I'd just like to thank Magda Katz and the Lambs Club for hosting this event.
Wonderful. Vicki, a lot of people watching tonight have a huge fan base because they loved the long, wonderfully detailed Volume 1 of Barbara Stanwyck. So I want to know, everybody here wants to know, how things are coming along with Volume 2.
Well, Volume 2 is, it's a sort of interesting story. Volume 2 is long, it's a long view, and it's a rich life. And there were approximately 50 pictures that she made. Very interesting, peculiar. They get odder and odder, and then they get, in many ways, more revealing of her at a certain point in her life. And it's a rich life, and there's a ton of digression. I mean, I've entertained myself, let's put it that way. And we could have a whole talk about being a writer and an editor at the same time. And as the editor says, just go ahead and write what you want and we'll deal with it later.
Are you allowing yourself to write everything down this time and then you'll edit it at a second when you go through it again?
No, but I have gone off. Go ahead, sorry.
Do you edit as you're writing and say, I don't need
Well,
this?
I mean, you go over your material sort of where you left off and then start up again. But basically, and occasionally I'll reread a chapter, but I don't really read it until the very end. And in fact, originally this was supposed to be a 1-volume book, and that's a long story of how it got to be a 2-volume book. But at the moment where I was allowed by the wonderful David Rosenthal to write, to make it 2 volumes, and I had to figure out how to shape it, I went back. And of course, I had read it. I was reading it. Well, I put the manuscript together, and then I started reading it, and I said, this manuscript is not ready for me to be editing this book. But I was the writer, even though I was the editor. But as the editor, I was saying, this manuscript is a total mess, and I shouldn't be reading it at this point. So the writer had to go back and rewrite many, many, many drafts as I pieced it together and then shaped it for this volume.
For Volume 1, we're talking about.
Yeah.
Volume 1. But Volume
Right.
1 ends in 1940?
Right.
And
Remember the Night.
Remember the Night. And she has 2 full decades of rich work in Hollywood. So by that measure, Volume 2 is going to be just as long and complex and rich, if not longer, than Volume 1. There's so many things to cover.
It can't be longer because I don't know that I'll survive it. But the thing is, it's such a rich life, and she's such an interesting woman, and it only gets darker. It gets darker and more complicated. And already she was very complicated, but she kept a lot of things in Volume 1. She kept a lot of darkness at bay, and And for part of volume 2, she does as well. And then things start to close in.
Do you feel living with her for so long, because the biographer lives with her subject? Are you enjoying her company? Is she continuously interesting and engaging for you?
Well, she's always engaging, and she's always complicated, and she's always intelligent. Certain things, it's interesting. It's funny because Magda said, I feel like I got to know her so well. And that is a great compliment. But I do have to confess, and I wonder how other biographers, I can see this. I publish a lot of biographies, and I can spot this a mile away because I've gone through this. I can tell when somebody is either frightened of their subject or is sort of writing around their subject for whatever reason.
Yes.
And, the darkness it's dark. And, I'm not there yet. I have to confess, I'm apprehensive on a lot of different levels about it. And I feel as if, I've asked other writers, okay, well, what have you learned? What have you gone through? What has been expiated or released in your going through this? And I do feel that getting to those points will be an interesting process for me.
Don't tell us, because I actually don't want to know, but have you gotten to any points where you thought, you know what, I don't think I'm going to include this?
Oh, many, many different points. Certainly in volume 1, there were a lot of things that I didn't include. And, also, if I didn't have, when you're writing a book, I don't know, maybe, Liza Alter is on this call or is watching this, and she's written nonfiction and she's a novelist. And, for each book, I think writers have rules. I'm sure, you've written a lot of books and you make up your rules for each book. And for this, for volume 1, at least, it's a standard rule that is, of course, 2 people or 3 people to corroborate something or to validate something. And so there were certain things that maybe I didn't have corroboration for. But, another thing that's very interesting about this process of writing biography is that you'll come to something and it'll be like a block. You will not get your answer. And then you let it go. And in this circuitous way, maybe a year later, the answer will present itself to you. And you will have that piece that you were looking for.
You don't push it.
That you couldn't find, there was no way to get it, and it just presents itself.
But then it gels somehow if you don't push it.
Yes, of course.
You don't push it, you let it sort of germinate organically.
Right. But you just have to sort of give up on it. I did speak to you, when I was writing my Otto Preminger book with you. There was something that I was told, and I thought, I suspect it's right, but I can't include it. I just can't include it. Of course, I'm not going to say what it is, but I couldn't include it. There must be moments where you think, I suspect that's the truth. I don't want to include it. Well, but you know what the flip side of that that's even more interesting is? You say, I suspect something is true, and I am going to include it. And that's the moment, I think, that's such an important moment in somebody writing a book, particularly nonfiction, where you're holding, you're holding on, your point is to try, one of your major points is you just want to get to the truth. And of course, there are many other things that you're concerned about and you're interested in, and you want to create a portrait and a picture of the time and all of that. But at the moment when you start to trust your instinct and you say, I'm going to piece this together this way, even though all of her friends might have said, I didn't know anything about it. And at the moment when you trust that instinct and make connections, That's the moment where you're off and flying.
But wouldn't you say you know more than anybody in the world about Barbara Stanwyck?
I absolutely would.
And
And you know, I really couldn't have picked a better subject, because what a fabulous woman. And you know, I was just, for many, many reasons, I have not watched her films because there are certain pictures that I'm going to be writing about, and I just didn't want to have her, I just didn't want to get tired of looking at her. And I was watching BF's Daughter the other night, which I hadn't seen in 1,000 years. And I hadn't seen her on screen in so long. And there's one scene with Charlie Coburn where he basically, where he's saying to her, "Are you happy? Are you happy, Paul?" And she answers no, one word. And that went through me in such a way. I mean, the shoals of expression, feeling, and voice that she got into that no. And I thought, that is exactly why I am so lucky to be writing about that woman.
Well, there's a scene, we've talked about this, there's a scene in Jeopardy where just with a movement of her shoulder, she indicates something so important. We won't tell it out for our listeners, but you know what I'm talking about. No dialogue,
I do.
But it's such a powerful moment, just body language. She didn't need dialogue, it's just body language. And it changes the whole dynamic of the character in the story. She's going to have to make a sacrifice at that point.
You know, the thing is that I was rereading the book, and that's an interesting conversation. I thought, well, I better reread it because it's been a while. And I had many reactions. One of them, the most constant, was anxiety, which is, where did I get that piece of information? Oh, I remember writing that. But then, of course, I just sort of got into it. And I have to say, it's a sort of, I just started reading it as a reader. And it's a piece of insanity, but it is a totally amazing book. But when you're talking about that with her, I mean, she learned that from many people. Arthur Hopkins, but you know, she really learned it from Frank Fay.
You mean
I think that the stripped downness, the simplicity, the simplest gesture. He was a master at that. And you know, I mean, in the book, in the volume 1, I say that, you know, Jimmy Cagney said that he learned to act from watching Frank Fay. And it is that same kind of simplicity. I mean, she takes it to a much larger and deeper and richer level than I think Cagney does. I mean, they're completely different sensibilities.
Do you know at this point, there's so many films in the 40s and 50s, do you know which films you're going to give a close-up on and which films you're going to just talk about in a more brief way? Because I've found for myself,
well, there are a lot of them.
You can't give equal emphasis to everything. You have to pick and choose.
No, you can't, and each film, you know, they don't all deserve it. I mean, there are going to be, and I'm not going to say what they are, because my favorite picture of all of her pictures of volume 2 is going to surprise everybody.
Really?
Totally.
Really?
And it's a very important picture, and it's a turning point for her, and nobody ever thinks about it, and it's one of the great pictures. And I mean, I spent a lot of time on that. There are a lot of pictures where I've spent a lot of time, and there are pictures that, you know, are just not that interesting. But there are a lot of them that are interesting, that people, you know, that were done in the 50s that people just really wouldn't pay any attention to, or they don't know.
Some of her 50s work is now quite obscure. And some of the titles, we could mention titles, and most of our people, as well versed as they are, might not have heard of the title. Do people know Witness to Murder, Crime of Passion? Terrific films.
But, you know, that was true, Foster, of book 1. I mean, I wrote, you know, they said, well, how can you write a book, when I was saying it was going to be volume 1, and no, Double Indemnity was not going to be in it? And people would say, how can you write a book about Barbara Stanwyck without Double Indemnity? Which, believe me, I've spent a great deal of, it's one of the, I had such a great time writing about Double Indemnity. But you know, there were so many movies in volume one. I said, believe me, you're not even going to miss Double Indemnity in volume one. And people didn't. But I had to write that book in such a way that a lot of people, many, many people who knew about Barbara Stanwyck didn't know a lot of these pictures. And so I had to write about them, not just, okay, here she is, here is who she's working with. But I had to show how the picture was important to her and also give a sense of what the picture was and her accomplishment in it.
And that'll be especially true in volume two, where a lot of the pictures will need to be introduced to the reader. There's so many films, and they're not all well known. Some of them are very little known, and they should be known. How many people have heard?
Well, they should be. And, you know, I do want to say something about, Turner Classic Movies, that for, you know, when the book was published, and before the book was published, and, you know, this was like the longest awaited book because it was so late, as is volume two. But there was a lot of Barbara Stanwyck on Turner Classic Movies. There isn't now. I don't know why, but they're not showing her pictures. And I want to make
They will when the book
complaint.
comes out. They will they will make them do it when the book comes out. Are there things,
let's hope so,
without specifying, but are there elements of her personality as you're digging more and more that you say, I don't like that. I'm not sure I like that element of this woman, or do you're enamored of her and you sort of give her a pass on everything, or you don't do that?
No, I mean, of course there are things about her. There were things about her in volume one that I thought, which in rereading it, I made a point of showing how, for instance, you know, it was like, I closed the iron door on you. You know, she came to California and her two closest friends, May Klotz, and otherwise known as May Clark, and Walter Mansfield, she totally drops. And she did that all along the way, where she dropped people, and that was it. And she does that in volume two to people who were very, very profoundly close to her. She never did it with Nancy Sinatra, but she did it to other people.
Wasn't she famous for being friendly to workers on the set?
Yes, and I get it, you know, that's an interesting notion that I had, because a lot of what, well, not a lot, but some of what I write about in volume one, and it becomes sort of less so in volume two, is it's a class portrait. It's a portrait of somebody who is from not middle class at all, and who is very intimidated and inhibited by that, and acts out in many, many different ways as a result of it. And I think it's one of the reasons why and even when she, you know, first went to Hollywood, and she felt excluded along with Frank Fay. And there, you know, that gets into another whole thing where they just felt it was the Fays against the world and against Hollywood. But I do see it as a sort of aspect of class jitters or discomfort.
But did they call her Missy?
Yes, and again, there is a portrait, there's a relationship that happens in book two that is one of the most important relationships in her life. And that's how, and that person started calling her Missy.
Okay, now you probably can't answer this, or maybe shouldn't, but I can say it. She was a great actress, but she was married to a man, her second husband, who, in my opinion, was not a very good actor, Robert Taylor. Did that have an impact in the marriage? There's a genius, an acting genius, then there's somebody I find rather stiff and wooden.
Well, Stanwyck liked pretty men. And there wasn't anybody who was prettier than Robert Taylor. But, you know, when you look at for instance, you know, she helped him. She gave him line readings. I mean, I describe in how in Camille, she gave him his line readings. And if you listen to it, you can hear her rhythm.
Really? She didn't help him.
And throughout a lot of the movies. And then you can see when they that's after Stanwyck. Can't blame Stanwyck for that. I was about to say, once they separate and that's the end, and Robert Taylor goes on to make the movies that he made. He was under contract to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer longer than any other actor.
It was a record.
And it was an interesting thing because her childhood was perfect training for Hollywood. She belonged to nobody. She was out on the streets. Even though she came from she did not come from that kind of a family. It was working class, but they were very proper people. But the whole family fell apart, and I write about all of that in volume 1. And, she basically was raised on the streets. And my dog is talking to me. And so when she gets to Hollywood, she basically, she's under contract to Warner Brothers, Columbia, Warner Brothers. She's under contract to different studios. She was an independent. And Robert Taylor, who came from the world's happiest family, stayed at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer until the end of the line.
And beyond, practically. He was one of the last under contract actors still working for Metro. I do talk about that. Will you get into her, let's put it this way, motherhood was not her best role?
Right, motherhood was not her best role, and it gets worse in volume 2. Okay. And I've told you this before, I did find the son, and that was an interesting story, how my friend Regina worked with somebody whose husband was in charge of security when the Pope came to New York. And when I first started this book, there was no internet. That's how long ago, how there is no Schubert Theater in San Francisco. Well, there was no internet when I started this book. And so this man who was in charge of security came into my office at Knopf, and he was carrying a briefcase, which I thought had probably a gun in it. And he took down the information about Tony Fay and Anthony Dion Fay. And 2 days later, he found it. And that was like a miracle because, he had to use, I think he used LexisNexis that only lawyers or police had access to. And he found him, and I called him up, and Tony was very helpful to me. As you well know, when you lose your sources, it's very upsetting. I mean, eventually he died. He did not have an easy life, but he was a nice man. He was saved. He was saved by the people who Stanwyck sort of threw him to.
Did you meet him in person, or was it just by phone?
He would never allow me to meet him. And in fact, it was a sort of interesting moment because he said, "No, I don't want you to meet me. I don't have any teeth." And, I called Nancy Sinatra, who was like my godmother during this writing of this book, volume 1. And I used to call her and read her chapters on the phone. That's Nancy Sinatra Senior, not Junior. And I called her and I said, "Do you think it's okay for me to send money to the dentist for his teeth?" And she said, "I don't think it's a good idea." So I didn't.
Let me ask, I can see this right out, you're a terrific editor. You're a born editor. Is there a similar skill between being a good editor and a good writer, or do they come from two different places? When you're writing, are you Vicki Wilson, the editor, or are you Vicki Wilson, the biographer, or do they interact?
No, they're two different places. I mean, it's like writing is, I've said this before, that when I'm editing, it's like getting into a warm bath. It's reading, it's following your instinct, and writing is following your instinct too, but you're following your instinct out of making something out of nothing. It's another thing to be reading something that other people have written, or even when when I was acting as my editor, I was tough, but you have to do what you have to do, but they come from completely different places.
So when you're writing,
I see writing as painting.
And then what is editing?
Editing is a road that's already laid out, and you're just reading, and look, all of this, everything, as you well know, everything really in life comes down to instinct and trusting your instincts. And if you're not attuned to that, or you block that out, or you don't trust where can you go? How can you can't move without that. And as a writer, this too. I mean, you have to trust your instincts with your ideas, with your connections. I don't mean connections of people. I mean connections of ideas that you're making, your thoughts. It's all about instinct and sensibility. Don't you think?
Very much so. But as you write, do you permit yourself to write anything at whatever length is needed, and then to go back and revisit it with a different hat on?
Yes, that's what. Well, I had to do that with Barbara Stanwyck, Volume 1, and in fact, it was interesting. I don't know whether Kathy Hargan is on this call, but Kathy is the managing editor at Knopf, and the great love of her life is Robert Caro, and she, along with Bob Gottlieb, has been editing Bob Caro for years and decades. And I had Kathy, read the manuscript, and if she said, okay, I would cut here, you have to trust your editor. And and so I trusted her and cut. I mean, I basically took the book apart and re-spliced it together, because I had written it in, okay, here's like a profile of this person, here's a profile of that person. I took all of that apart and spliced it together so it didn't read like that at all. I mean, here you are working on, how many books have you written? How many books have you written?
15, I think.
Okay. The great story I have to tell about Foster Hirsch is that when I started writing, I started doing research for Barbara Stanwyck, and I ordered a lot of books. And one of them was this book on film noir by Foster Hirsch. And I got the book and I started reading it, and I thought, God, this is a fabulous book. Let me try and get a hold of this guy. Where am I going to find him? Where am I going to find him? And so I said to my assistant, I can't find this guy. Can you see if you can find him? And 2 minutes later, he came in with your number. And I said, where did you get that? The phone book. It's a nice Jewish girl who thinks of looking in the phone book. Anyway, so, and, I called you, and then we lived happily ever after.
Yeah, we're still working together. Has Barbara Stanwyck given you permission to investigate her life?
Absolutely. On so many levels, starting with when I first started, I have to confess, I went to this woman who I had gone to this dinner party. I don't know whether it was at Eleanor Lambert's or what. It was somebody like that, in that realm. And this woman was talking about, a psychic that she had gone to see. So I thought, all right, I'm going to see what Barbara Stanwyck has to say about my doing this. And I didn't tell her anything, didn't go into any specifics. There was definitely a message. Yes, go ahead. And one of the great things, it doesn't happen that much, but it will when it's going to start more, is when I dream, when Stanwyck appears in a dream. That's a great moment.
But you do feel she's looking over you, and it's all right for you to be explaining her life to the world.
Well, you know, as I was rereading this, I thought, this woman would be so happy with this book. She would be amazed. She would be amazed at what and you know, in the dream is always that she's alive, and I'm trying to talk to her, and for some reason I either can't get to her, or she's there and she's not speaking. And I'm speaking for her. But I mean, Nancy Sinatra, who, you know, was her best, closest, longest pal, you know, wrote something about the book. And that was very meaningful to me. She really was like a mother to me on that, during those years.
Now, changing chapters or changing pages, I want to hear about, and I know our viewers want to hear about, you had a very, very famous stepmother, which people might be surprised to hear about, Stella Adler.
Stella Adler was well, first, yeah, but first I just have to say.
A great acting teacher. Was she a great stepmother?
A stepmother. Well, was she a good mother? Alas, Ellen Adler, you know, died a few months ago.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I, you know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and that was upsetting. But, you know, I had a great mother to begin with. I had a fabulous mother. And she was an extraordinary woman, and in many ways. And I think, and she gave me in so many ways the foundation to cope with Stella. But, you know, Stella came into my life when I was about 15 or 16. And I could tell a few stories about how that happened, but I'll save that. And she and my father had a few houses out in Watermill. And I thought, okay, well, the first time I walked into her apartment, which was at 1016 Fifth Avenue, I think that's where it was, and right across from the museum, I walked into that apartment, and my father was a very elegant man, but it was not about adornment. It was about simplicity and elegance. And I walked into that apartment. I don't know, I'm sure my sister Erica felt the same way, but I walked into that apartment and I thought, okay, basically, Dorothy, I'm not in Kansas anymore. And, you know, I don't know, it was like a Venetian museum. And, you know, there were cupids everywhere, and gold and Venetian green, and it was another world. But I used to go out to their house in Watermill. For a while, there was one summer where they rented Jerome Robbins' house, and I just remember that Stella put up, I can't imagine that Robbins had this, but Stella put up beaded curtains everywhere. You know, she was always, as my father would say, you know, you dress for people in the balcony, because her clothes would be ripped, the gloves would be dirty, or the gloves would be ripped, there'd be holes in the stockings. But she was, you know, and I always, even though I was like, I mean, I was, you know, a teenager, it was not easy, but she was irresistible. She was irresistible. She was impossible, but irresistible. I'd walk in the house, and I was a kid, and but smoking. And she would hand me the ashtray, and she would say, "Here, darling, do not put this down. Walk around with this." And, you know, it was like Agnes Gooch. I mean, it was Auntie Mame and Agnes Gooch. And thank God I grew out of Agnes Gooch, nor did I get pregnant. And, but so what happened was my father died at 58. He had a sudden heart attack. And Stella was much older than my father. And she was basically horrible. And I didn't see her for a very long time and went about my life. And I met Ellen once on the subway. And that was great. And she said, why don't you come for Thanksgiving dinner? And I thought, well, okay, I'll give that a shot. And Stella, of course, was there. And it was at a moment when I was thinking about writing a book about Alla Nazimova.
Yes.
And, you know, in the Moscow Art Theater and all of that. And so I can't go, it's sort of too private to go into what happened when I saw her and how I felt. But it was a connection to my father. And that was powerful. And so I went to see her and asked her about it. She did not really want to hear about Alla Nazimova, that's for damn sure. But I was publishing the letters of Tennessee Williams to Maria St. Just. And she was teaching I guess a master class. It wasn't a master class. It was like a master class in various playwrights, and one of them was Tennessee Williams. And I said, can I come and watch can I come and audit? And she said yes. And I went. I left my office at 4:00. It was when we were at 201 East 50th Street. And I think they were at City Center then. And I went over there. And and it was a performance. But the amazing thing was, it completely transformed my life. It completely just changed my life, because there was nobody in the world who talked and thought the way Stella did. It was such an education on such a high level. And then we would, you know, have dinner after. And I did this, you know, my life changed. I did this, you know, for class after class. And I actually got to a point where I thought, well, maybe I would even try and take acting lessons. And then she moved to California. I mean, they had been going back and forth because she was teaching classes in California. And, you know, what happened was that she would save all of her energy for that performance.
It was a performance.
And
the teaching was a performance.
Yeah, absolutely. But it was so, I can't even, sort of words fail me in describing how intense and extraordinary her mind was. And what happened was that I opened in the hall closet one day, I opened the closet door, and from the top shelf to the bottom shelf were all of her lectures, from everybody from Aeschylus all the way up or down to Albee and whatever. And I said, and everybody, a lot of publishers were after her. They wanted her to do books with them. And she agreed to do 2 books with me. And I published her lectures on the Europeans, Ibsen, Strindberg, and Chekhov, and then on, you know, the American masters, from O'Neill all the way, again, to, you know,
you talk, Vicki, you talk about instinct being so important to you. I met Stella and I got to know her. She had fabulous instinct, because I was doing my book on the Actors Studio and I was auditing her classes. And I once went up to her and said, could I have an private interview with you? And she said, oh no, darling, I can't do that. It's just too much. And we talked for a few minutes, and she said, and I'll never forget it, she said, I see you deserve an interview. Would you come to my apartment and I'll speak to you for a half hour? And she served coffee in the most elegant cup on an elegant silver tray. It was a grand performance, and she gave me a fabulous interview that went on for far more than a half hour. She was great.
Well, tell us what she said.
She was talking about Strasbourg in the interview.
So she must have said a lot.
She said a lot. And it's in
but
the
when
book.
when you were listening to that class, do you not feel how? I mean, do you not see what I'm saying? Did you not feel that?
Absolutely. Her instincts about literature, about plays, she knew more than professors of literature. And she kept saying, oh, I
Oh,
don't know
much more.
the way professors of literature do. I'm not a historian. But her knowledge of the material as theater and literature was deeper than most professors can ever hope to get. She was a genius. She was absolutely brilliant.
She
And
was.
she seemed formidable, but I thought beneath the veneer of being so formidable, she really wasn't a forbidding woman at all.
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, I worked through, it was a gift that I was able to work through and put all of the other stuff aside. And I thought, you know, my father brought me this woman, and this is the gift. And regardless of all of his faults or flaws or character defects or whatever, as we all have, you know, it was a miracle that I worked through that and that we became as close as we did. And we really did. And I also published a memoir by Jacob Adler that had never been translated into English. And, you know, I think about that book a lot. And I think it was Lella Rosenfeld, Stella's niece, who translated it, and I had her annotate it, and it was fascination.
I want to mention your father because Mitchell Wilson, who was sort of extraordinary. Wasn't he a scientist and a physicist? But he wrote a novel.
He was a physicist. Well, he wrote many novels.
But he wrote one novel, and you know where I'm going, that became the basis of a Jean Renoir film called The Woman on the Beach, starring Joan Bennett and Robert Pye. And
you know, go ahead.
Yeah, and you introduced it at Film Forum once, The Woman on the Beach.
Right.
It's a Renoir film that isn't so well known. It's a flawed film, but very interesting. Really interesting.
Well, you know,
better known than it is.
The thing about that book,
should be better known than it is. That film should be better known than it is.
Well, the problem with the film is that it was Jean Renoir's last American movie, and it was sort of torn apart and put back together in like 15 different ways. But the novel is a fascination because I'm sort of amazed when I read it, because it's about this, Charles Bickford plays the painter. It's about this man who's a painter who is blinded. And he's married to this woman who's all in the novel, who's also a painter. Now that was very unusual. I mean, I published a biography of Joan Mitchell, and Joan Mitchell, I mean, women weren't allowed to be painters. That woman, Joan Mitchell, practically had to talk about breaking through a glass ceiling. She had to break through a glass house to be acknowledged. But my father wrote this book in 1946 about this woman who was a painter, and the husband, and the competition between the husband and the wife. And then along comes this man, the military guy who is recuperating from being traumatized in the war. And he falls in love with the woman, and he's not sure if the man is blind. And you don't know if the husband is really blind or not. Jean Renoir changed the ending. And you know, it's terrible. I hate to say this story, because I once asked my father why he changed the story, why he changed the ending. Because he asked Renoir, why did you change the ending? But I can't remember what he said, so I hate to tell you.
But the novel is called None So Blind. None So Blind is the name of the novel.
None So Blind.
None So Blind. Which is a very
but he wrote a lot of novels, and he was a physicist, and he worked at Columbia with Enrico Fermi and I. Rabi, and he was asked to go to work on the Manhattan Project, and he said no, unlike all the other scientists who said they didn't know what they were doing and what it was going to be used for. He knew what it was going to be used for, as they all did, and he declined. And that was a major decision in his life, as one could imagine. And then he went on to become this, he made a living as a writer. But what was interesting about him is, this was in the height of the Cold War. Do not ask me why. Russians adored his writing. He became this huge best-selling writer in Soviet Russia. And not only that, but the Russians paid royalties for his books, which the Russians were famous for pirating everybody's books and never paying a penny. And he couldn't take the money out of Russia. And he taught himself Russian, and he would go to Russia a lot. And that leads to another whole story where, after I remember when they passed the Freedom of Information Act. That was like in 1973. And on a lark, I wrote to the CIA and said, I'd like to see my file, thinking, well, what are they going to have? And what comes back is an envelope from the Central Intelligence Agency filled with letters that I had written to my father.
Oh my goodness. When
I was in second, third, and fourth grades, and his answers to me, and they're written in, a child's handwriting, saying, Daddy, would you bring home, because he had all this money in Russia, but he couldn't take it out of the country. So I said, would you please bring home gadgets and whatever else he could, it was all junk, of course, because it was, Soviet Russia. But anyway, the point is that there was a lot of news about that, and the ACLU had what was it called? It was a class action suit, and for violation, for privacy. I remember Mel Wolf called me up one day. I was a baby. I was at Knopf. I'm always have been at Knopf forever, but he called me up and he said, would you mind if we called the case, used your name for the case? And I said, well, what do I get? Like a bathing suit. Anyway, so the case was called Victoria Wilson versus the United States of America. And we won.
I didn't know that story.
We got a letter of apology. I can't remember who was the head of the CIA at that point. Anyway, there's another end to that story, but for another time.
Before we open the floor to questions from our listeners, I want to ask you in a general sense, is this terrible pandemic a good time for reading, writing, book selling, publishing? My sense is it is. People are reading, people are buying books. Aren't you publishing? You're signing authors, you're publishing books, and you're continuing.
We're publishing books, and books are selling, and we're not, and Kathy Zuckerman is on this call, who's the great publicist at Knopf.
The best.
And she will attest, not only that, but I've watched this company, which is Elephantine, turn on a piece of salt, a grain of salt, and start to figure out in a second another way of selling books and having author events. And this is the result. And these great events are fabulous because people I did an event with Liza Alter where from a book in Asheville, and there were 400 people who watched that event, 100 on Zoom, and the others came from outer space. No, they came from Facebook. And that's amazing. You didn't have to go anywhere. She was barefoot through the entire talk, and there was no money spent on travel, no money spent on publicity, and then people went out of their way to buy books from the independent bookstore.
So this is a good time for reading and writing.
Well, it's
selling.
It is. I mean, writing is interesting. I mean, I've had a hard time. I've had to acclimate being here and working. I finally am comfortable working here, and going to be going back full tilt to Stanwyck because there was just too much happening. The man for whom we all worked for 30 odd years died in December, Sonny Mehta, the great Sonny Mehta. And then Reagan Arthur came to head Knopf, and it's been a lot of change. But in terms of publishing in general, it's been fabulous.
Yeah, so the
great lesson is that people want to be told stories.
And I think reading becomes more important than ever now at this particular point.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, I'm reading up a storm. Because you feel you have to go in at this point. You have to go inward.
And you're writing up a storm, and I haven't asked you any questions about movies of the 50s.
I am writing up a storm. I had a very good writing day today. I was revising my section on method acting in the 50s. So it's not bad, but I'm writing up a storm. So anyway, Mark, I think we can open the floor to questions for Vicki.
All right. I've got a few here I'll read off. First, from Michael Colby. And Michael, I'm going to combine your two. Michael says, the night he met Barbara Stanwyck, she spoke so lovingly of Robert Taylor, and you could still see she was infatuated. And then he asked, he knew Barbara through Shirley Eder, or Eder. And he talked.
Shirley Eder.
Right, and he wanted to know if you knew Shirley.
I did know Shirley. I met her. For the longest time, she refused to talk to me because she wanted to be loyal to Stanwyck. And but I did finally meet her, and she was sort of at the end of. She wasn't at the end of her life, but she developed Alzheimer's. But here's the great thing: I guess John isn't on this call. I became great friends with John Slotkin, her son, and Shirley and Stanwyck. That's a very complicated relationship, which I'm going to write about, and very complicated. And they had a 30-year correspondence. And at a certain point, I bought some letters from John from that correspondence, and then he just gave me the whole copy of it. But what I did with I thought, what am I going to do with these letters? I can't put them in the lettuce crisper in the refrigerator, but I have to protect them because they're original letters. So I went to my local Agway and bought a fireproof gun safe, which is where those letters are now.
All right, I have from Leslie Middlebrook. If you suspect
and
that
let me just ask you, Michael Colby, one other question. I'd like to get in touch with you to have a conversation with you about your meeting her.
Okay. They know how to get in touch with me. I was a guest a couple of weeks ago, and I spoke about Stanwyck on this forum. So they have my email address. And I have a www.michaelcolby.com.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Okay, I have from Leslie Middlebrook. If you suspect that something is true, can you not publish it unless you absolutely know that it's true? Otherwise, does it not betray her memory?
It really depends on what it is. It depends on, if it's a hunch about her, and it depends on what it is. If it's a huge thing, I wouldn't, without corroboration from a couple of other people.
All right, from Arrow Rappaport, how did Stella and Lee Strasberg get along?
Go ahead, Foster. You can answer that question.
I was in Stella's class the day Lee Strasberg died, and Stella began the class with a sentence I will never forget. It will take decades for the American theater to overcome the damage that this man has caused. That's how they got along.
So that's a no. Again, from Leslie, she writes, she just saw Babyface for the first time. How old would she have been? It seemed incredibly ahead of its time in terms of the work relationships and women rejecting men for sexual harassment and turning it around.
Let's see, she was probably, stop it, Blossom. She was probably, let's see, 31. She's born in 7. You know, she was in her early 20s, and you know, she was involved. She worked with Zanuck on the development of that script. But the movie, you know, everybody always says Babyface, and you know, it's slightly irritating to me because it is, yes, it is a shocking movie, but the movie that's much more shocking that she made with William Wellman is a movie called Night Nurse. Infinitely more shocking. The mother is murdering her children, starving them to death. And Stanwyck is the nurse. And Clark Gable is the chauffeur. And it's the first picture where it said, I tell the story that, you know, it was Barbara Stanwyck in Babyface. And the second week it was Barbara Stanwyck in Babyface with Clark Gable. Then by the third week, it was Barbara Stanwyck, Clark Gable in Babyface on the marquee. That was the movie that sort of broke him out. But that movie, Night Nurse, it's a much more shocking picture than Babyface, and much more disturbing.
From Jeffrey Lieber, 2 of his favorite Stanwyck films of the 1950s were directed by Douglas Sirk. I wonder if you think Sirk saw something in Stanwyck different from other directors.
Well, you know, she worked with a lot of people. I think they all saw something different in her. But you can't really separate those 2 movies from that period. I mean, Foster, you can answer this. You're writing about this.
Well, I am. I would say you were talking about in her work, there's a sort of stripping down and a basic simplicity. I think a masterful demonstration of that is There's Always Tomorrow. Oh, is that the right? Right, the Douglas Sirk film.
Yes, right, yes.
Which is, I think, her last great performance, and it's so simple and so effortless, and that's an extraordinary film. Jeffrey, wonderful that you bring up the Douglas Sirk films. He's my favorite director, and those are 2 of my favorite Stanwyck performances. But the one with There's Always Tomorrow is special because there's such a stripping down of her art, and it could only be the sort of thing that an artist could do after decades of working as a craft.
Okay, from Robin Reiser, in any of your research, was there a point where you had gone all along believing one truth about Barbara and then came upon a bit of information that completely turned your head around?
Yes. Where she I don't know who she was kidding, but I believed it. Where she said she never could have children because she was a bleeder. Now, you couldn't be a bleeder and that was her word, not mine. You couldn't be a bleeder and do all of the stunts that she did, and was very proud that she did them. And it was, this is how writing biography works. I was on a trip to Florida, and somehow I found a woman who had traveled with Stanwyck I think it might have been in burlesque. And she confirmed that Stanwyck had had a botched abortion when she was about 15. And that's why, she couldn't have children. But I had to sort of redo that. But that's a big example of that.
But she never mentioned that. It was never public.
That she had an abortion?
Right.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
All right, Magda Katz has a question. Magda, why don't you unmute yourself?
Okay, two things that stood out. When you're describing Frank Fay, I've never seen him, but when you talk about how Jack Benny and Bob Hope walked on stage, I was able to see it because I never realized that the two of them walked the same way, and that came from Frank Fay, which was fascinating. My other point was that I got the feeling of a little bit of the older men that she sort of seduced. Did I get the wrong impression? There was these young girls, especially in the case of I think it was her who told the young girl, the underage girl, to
May Klotz.
Yeah, she wanted the code, and she
May Klotz.
Yeah, could you tell that just a little bit about that? It was that very common?
I think she was at the Strand roof at that point, and the guy who's the manager said, "There's a young kid coming in, and I want you to look out for her." And her name, it was May Klotz, and her father happened to be sort of like the most famous piano accompanist in Philadelphia. Anyway, here was May Klotz, who was coming to the big city, and she was thrilled that she was dancing. And here was this woman who was going to help her out. And she said that, Ruby Stevens was, talked very tough with her and basically said, look, here's what you do. You've had your little boyfriends, but now that's over. And what you do is when you go out with these guys, let's say you see a coat in the window, you say, I'd really love to have that coat, and eventually he will say, well, I'd love to buy it for you. And Stanwyck says, Ruby Stevens says, well, look down and demur and say, of course you can't take it. And then, of course, he buys the coat. And then May Klotz said, well, then I went home, and he said, okay, and now it's time, to basically pay up. And she said, absolutely not. And he snatched the coat and left. And supposedly, I wasn't there, but I've heard this twice. Ruby said, look, if you want the coat, this is what you have to do.
Oh. Do you think that she used her sexuality in Hollywood to get where she was going?
Well, that's an interesting question, because somebody said that somebody was writing about, one of your guests said that somebody was writing about Joan Crawford. It's interesting, the difference between the way Joan Crawford uses sexuality and the way Stanwyck does, because Stanwyck is she uses it totally, but she's very restrained, and it's sort of held in check, and that tension is what makes it so sexual. Where Joan Crawford is, it's a whole other kettle of poisson. And but it's interesting because they were both friends, and I write a lot about that friendship in this book, and what happens later is interesting too in volume 2.
Could I ask a question?
She used it.
Yeah.
Go ahead. What did you say, Foster?
Yeah, I was going to say, in the 40s and the 50s, so many interesting films. Was there ever a point in any one of them where you said to yourself, I have no idea why she agreed to do this project?
I always knew why if they were terrible. I mean, there's comes a moment, I don't want to give the line, but there comes a moment where it's very hard for her to find work. And she wanted to work, and she was going to work, and she needed to work. And as I explained in volume 1, and I spend a lot of time, it's not just like, okay, here's 3 sentences or a chapter on this, it's throughout. Her family, the family that she had and felt and was comfortable with was the family of her work. That whole process was family to her. And, you know, it didn't matter that, you know, and people would become very close to her. And then after she was finished with the movie, she changed her number. So if there was a movie that wasn't great, but sometimes, you know, there are movies that are terrible and there's something interesting about them. There are a number of movies that I write about where that's the case.
Could you find anything interesting to say about The Moonlighter?
I'll leave that to you.
Okay.
She wanted to work.
You want to work.
And also it was in cinema. Wasn't that, it was in 3D.
It was in 3D.
And she probably, yeah. I mean, you know, the thing about that time, and I write about this in an oblique way, but in a lot of detail in volume 2, is the kind of feeling of desperation that takes over, that infects everything. And it's not just political, it's cultural. It takes over and infects everything at the end of the Second World War.
Do her politics get any more liberal in volume 2?
No.
No.
Why? No, absolutely not.
No. She never changed her political stripes.
Well, you know, she was interesting. I mean, look, she says in book 1, you know, when Adolphe Menjou says, they're not, you know, I've hidden the gold all over my property. They're never going to get my gold. When Roosevelt was taking the country off the gold standard. And, you know, that was Stanwyck. She didn't want, you know, no taxes. I mean, she didn't want to be taxed to death. She hated Roosevelt, and she, you know, supported her former acting colleague, Ronald Reagan.
She was a Republican at a time when it meant something different than it does now, just as being a Democrat now is not what it was before. Parties have changed.
Right, exactly. And she was definitely from an old family of Republicans in the old school, the Lincoln Republicanism. Blossom, stop crying.
Well, I think we have time now to open up mics for a few questions. Just try to not step over each other with your questions. So if you have one now, unmute yourself and start. All right, I guess then we're back to you.
Dare I ask
There you are.
when we might see volume 2?
No.
Well, that's why I dared.
You know better than that, Stephen.
I know nothing. But I live in hope.
Good.
What
Day at a time.
Victoria, you mentioned the son, but that was an adopted son?
Yes,
Oh, I see. How many children did she adopt? Because I didn't get to that yet.
1, and thank God.
Unbelievable.
She was a great screen mother. She was a great mother on screen.
When you said that she came from an old family of Republicans, I thought you had previously said that she sort of came from the street, from maybe a lower middle class.
Yeah, what happened was that she came from she came from a very old New England family. In fact,
I
Stanwyck,
misunderstood you.
No, because it's complicated. You didn't misunderstand. I did say all
Oh.
of those things. It's what happened to the family. And I write about it in detail because there were like two halves of that family. She had three older sisters, and they lived in the small town right outside of Gloucester. And the father had wanted to become a lawyer, and instead had to, his father died, and he went to work in a quarry in the town and became a mason. And what happened is, because of the Industrial Revolution, they moved. They went from town to town. Eventually they ended up in Brooklyn. And the father left and the family came back together. It's a whole long story. But the three older girls, who were like 18, 19, and 20 years older than Stanwyck, were raised in this sort of very formal New England way. And Stanwyck is a daughter of the American Revolution, Stanwyck's family, which nobody would imagine.
That's pretty fascinating. Cute.
Well, if you read the book, you'll see that I went into all this detail because of the Industrial Revolution that changed all of these, people left these small towns and went to the big city. And what happened was the mother then had a son who was 4 years older than Stanwyck, and then had Stanwyck. And then when they were in Brooklyn, the mother was pregnant with another child. And she was on a trolley and had an axe. A man pushed her and she fell. And what happened was that she went into labor and she developed septicemia and she died.
Oh.
And then the father left because he couldn't deal. And there were the three adult sisters who had their own families at that point. And Stanwyck and her brother Bai were sort of moved from family home. And they didn't have foster this or that. They were just sort of moved from family to family in the neighborhood. And then occasionally the sisters would take Stanwyck and Bai. And, I went to her school, I think it was PS 152 in Brooklyn. And her card wasn't there. Her, as they say, her permanent record card wasn't there, but Bai's was. And between first grade and eighth grade, he had gone to like 15 different schools because they had been moved so many times.
Oh my word! Wow.
So, but the original family and the way that she was raised, and so those three sisters carried on and upheld those traditions. And that was the sort of formal republicanism that I was talking about.
I see. Really interesting.
So I remind everybody in the email invitation for tonight's conversation, there is a link to purchase volume 1 of the book. And I'll turn it back to Foster for possibly one more question, and then we'll finish up. And I'll remember, we'll ask everybody not to sign off after we say our thank yous. We have a little surprise in store. Go ahead, Foster.
Okay, I'll end with maybe a controversial question, but am I wrong in saying that Barbara Stanwyck's two husbands had anti-Semitic tendencies? I know Frank Fay did because you write about it very volubly in the book, but I believe Robert Taylor did as well.
That's true, and I will be writing about it.
So that both their husbands were anti-Semites.
It's
Yes.
interesting because one of the things she
But
said,
she was not, of course.
she stayed with a family that was Jewish, and she spoke very lovingly of that family.
Yes, right. But there are other things that that Tony Fay said, and that's an interesting point about what would I put in and what would I not put in, and I haven't gotten there, so I don't have to cope with that yet.
It's fascinating. I think, Mark, we should
So
end.
anyway,
Yeah.
Thanks. I want to.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. You've done a fabulous job, and the time just flew by. And as usual, it was, like dancing with Fred Astaire.
Thank you, both of you. It was absolute. I'm so thrilled that I'm reading your book, and I recommend it very highly. And it's wonderful
Great
meeting.
book.
Thank you, Magda.
Great book. And Vicky's a great editor. We've had
And
the
stay
honor.
tuned for Foster's because he's got a new book coming.
Yeah, that's. I hope it'll be good. I hope it'll be at the level of yours.
I'm sure it will. I can't wait to read it.
We have had the honor, folks, of listening to really one of America's greatest editors and a legend in publishing. She works for the greatest publishing company in America, Alfred Knopf, and I hope it's not going to change much. I hope it'll keep its traditions. If it ain't changed, if it ain't broken, don't fix it.
You've got a point.
Well, on behalf of the Lambs, we thank you, Victoria. We thank Foster, and we thank Magda Katz for arranging all this. Magda is a member of the Lambs. Magda, do you want to shoot out info on our next event?
Yes. Our upcoming will be Marion Ross, who is the mother in Happy Days, and she has quite a history in films, which is fascinating. And she will be interviewed by Jim Brochu. Then we have Piper Laurie, who will be interviewed by Foster. And then we have Bobby Rydell. Do you remember all from the 50s, Ball Out In, all the great songs?
Oh my
He will be
God.
with us on August 19th.
And Bye Bye Birdie.
That's right, Bye Bye Birdie, right.
When is the Marion Ross? What is that?
You'll get the emails like, they're not set up yet.
That'll be
Oh, they're not. Oh, sorry.
You get the emails. You'll need the information to log in from the email.
I know. I just wanted.
just keep those dates open, 5, 10, and 19.
Oh, thank you.
That's why in Greece, the high school was Rydell High School.
That's right. He'll talk about it. He's a wonderful, wonderful man.
Well, thank you very much all for joining us. Now, before you sign off, Foster, Mr. Hirsch, for many years, you have been doing interviews for the Lambs at the Lambs. We've had some great evenings thanks to your skills. And during this downtime of the pandemic, you've also been very generous in hosting. We've always introduced you as a friend of the Lambs, but unfortunately, we're not going to say that anymore. We are now going to say that Foster Hirsch is an honorary member of the Lambs.
Bravo, bravo.
Yay, Foster.
Oh, how wonderful. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Last night at the meeting of the Council of the Lambs, the council unanimously decided to grant you honorary membership, and now be aware this is a real membership. So whenever we get back to the space, which you know well, we will set you up with your own membership.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. And I will take full advantage of it and your wonderful restaurant and clubhouse. Thank you.
And everyone else, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Good night, all.
Thank you.
Vicky. Thank you.
And I'd like
Bravo,
to,
Vicky.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Robbie, thank you so much. It's fascinating.
anyone else who'd like to join, please look at the site. Mark, can you mention that?
It's thelambs.org, and the -lambs is a dash between the two, thelambs.org. Again, we're the oldest professional theatrical organization in New York since 1874.
Wow.
We've been at a current location at 3 West 51st Street now for almost 45 years. And we have an assortment of events and member benefits. You can look on our website, and you can email admissions@thelambs.org if you want more information about joining.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Have a good evening.
You too. Great.
Thank you.
Thank
Congratulations, Foster.
Thank you.
Thank you for, it was so fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you.
Great evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.